How can a known poison that exists in our food supply, our medications, and sometimes even in the air we breathe, be totally overlooked as the cause of disease in America? Watch us daily and soon you too will know the cause. And then opening the show all the way from Brisbane, Australia, is Dr. Greg Emerson. Dr. Emerson, when was the point that you got it that fungus was contributing to a whole lot of ill health in your patients? He's going to join us today. Smiling face here. And welcome back, my friends. And I promised you in the opening of the show just a moment ago that Dr. Greg Emerson from Brisbane. Did I say that right?
Perfect.
Brisbane, because I always say Brisbane, Australia. Wouldn't you say that at home? And second, I'm in the south here, so Brisbane, but it's Brisbane.
Brisbane.
Australia. Welcome aboard and thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
You know, I interviewed you a year ago or so, and you were so popular, just what you had to say, but I have to touch on a couple things I didn't ask you last time. You started out life after medical school as an emergency room doctor. When did the epiphany come on board that that wasn't necessarily what you wanted to do, that you really wanted to look at herbs and foods as healing instead of medicines?
That's a great question. There are a number of things that came along, but one thing really stands out, and the one thing was a case that I was involved in. The work I had been doing was very stressful, and then one night I just finished my shift, and I just left the emergency department to go home, and as I was leaving I saw it was late at night, it was just as the sun was going down, and I could hear the ambulance coming. Now I was meant to go home, but I could hear the ambulance coming. I thought I'd stay around and help out just in case they needed me. Mm-hmm. The paramedics brought in a young woman who'd been in a car accident, and they were putting an oxygen mask on her face and bagging some oxygen in. And they brought her into the emergency department, and despite them giving her oxygen, she was still purple, hadn't become pinked up as you would normally do when you get adequate levels of oxygen. It turned out she'd been in a car accident and had been thrown forward into the steering wheel. So the doctor I was working with, my registrar, who was training to be a specialist, had a look down her throat and said, look, I can put the tube down into her lungs to help oxygenate airways, as you know about, because as you've been a medic. And I said, great, go ahead and do that. So he put the tube down into her lungs and started to pump the oxygen directly into her lungs, which should normally fix the problem. But it didn't fix the problem, and as I watched, her neck started to get bigger and bigger and expand. And we realised what had happened was that her trachea, the windpipe from her mouth down to her lungs, had been torn and the two ends were now separated. The only thing, as you know, and you can do in that situation, is that you have to open the neck. So I put first of all, I put a needle into her neck and tried to thread a tube down into her airway to get the tube into her lungs, but it wouldn't. The tube wouldn't feed in properly. So I then had to make a small horizontal incision in her neck to put the bigger tube down, but again that wouldn't feed in properly. So I had to put my finger down into that hole, and all I felt was broken cartilage and blood, and I realised that the whole area had been completely traumatised. The only thing you can do in that situation is to open the neck vertically, so I had to make a vertical incision in her neck from her chin down to the top of her chest. At this stage her heart had stopped beating and she had got into a cardiac arrest, so it really was, we only had a few minutes to make a difference. And I put my hand into her neck and I felt around in her neck, and I eventually found the trachea right down just above her collarbone. I felt the hole with my finger, and eventually I was able to trace the tube down my finger into her trachea, and we got the tube into at that stage. And she was a very young woman. And unfortunately, even though we were able to oxygenate her lungs, we were never able to get her heart started. And I had to go out and tell her father. And I've done this lots of times. I've been 20 years in the emergency department. But this was the first time I really realised that I had been spending my time at the bottom of the cliff, and I went away for the first time ever, and I just shook for an hour after telling her father that I wasn't able to get her back. And I shook for an hour, and I realised then that I'd spent 20 years standing at the bottom of the waterfall, helping people who'd come down the waterfall, and I felt now that I was going to be at a better use of my time and my commitment to actually getting upriver and stopping people from falling in the river and coming down the waterfall in the first place.
Were there people in that transition that inspired you, that you thought, okay, I can follow this person?
Look, there's been three people who've really inspired me. The first guy I'll tell you, you're probably going to laugh at, because he's not somebody you would typically expect to come from someone like me, and that person was actually Bruce Lee. For a couple of reasons. Bruce Lee, the martial arts. Yeah. Now, a lot of people do say that, but here's the reason why that was for me. One, my dad used to take me there as when I was a kid. That's what we used to do on the weekends. And secondly, Bruce Lee, the other thing was that Bruce Lee was the first guy really to bring to the younger people of the world that personal philosophy was important in life. And a couple of things that he talked about was that he talked about the art of fighting without fighting. If you said to Bruce Lee, what should I do if I'm in a dark alley at 3 in the morning and three men are coming up to me, he'd say, well, you should ask yourself what you're doing in an alleyway at 3 in the morning. And it's the same thing with health, really. It's the same thing, that it's better off not to get in that situation in the first place. The second thing he talked about was taking what works and using it and getting rid of what doesn't work. Same thing in medicine that I do now in medicine. If it works, it doesn't matter what part of medicine it comes from. If it's acupuncture, it's energy medicine, you use it, and you get rid of the stuff that doesn't work.
He was an inspiration.
He was an inspiration to me, as was Jim Rohn, the late, great Jim Rohn. You know, when Jim Rohn talked about that you either suffer the discipline, the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. And I think that's really important, that we all have daily disciplines. The key to life and the key to longevity and health is trying to work out how do you make those daily disciplines not painful but also fun. And that's a really key thing to learn. So he was very good. And the other person, of course, was Gandhi, because Gandhi personified, you know, be the change that you want to be in the world. And that's really what I'm about. I'm not about changing other people. I'm saying this is what I'm doing, this is how I do it, and come along for the ride if you want to, because this is the benefits I'm getting from doing it.
That's awesome. Dr. Greg Emerson is here today, all the way from Australia, visiting us. Before we let him go away today, what I want to do is talk to him. This man understands the fungus philosophy, and he's taken it to a whole other country and is really practicing a lot of this over there. And so I want to talk to him about things like, well, maybe mushrooms. When we get back, we'll have a few more segments, and then I want to come back with a few minutes with Dr. Greg Emerson, so don't go away.